Okay, today we're going to go over customer lifetime value, how to calculate that on SAS. And as you probably know, customer lifetime value and its formula isn't too complicated, so it's going to be not too hard in terms of programming, but however, you do a lot of operations on SAS, so you'll get yourself a little bit more familiar with operating and coming with data sets and manipulating data sets and arranging them here and there on SAS. Okay, so for having customer lifetime value, you probably have to have the margin and your retention rate and your discount rate. So I'm just going to give it a initial value of margin as 100 and retention rate as zero point 0.9 and discount rate as zero point 0.1. So the first step that I need to do is calculate your simple CLV value, that is margin, multiply that by retention rate, divide that by 1 plus the discount rate minus the retention rate. So it's fairly easy. So I could just probably run this, and if I look at the result, I'm going to look at my data tab here, and I get a CLV value of 450. So that's pretty nice and easy. It wasn't too complicated, and it was fairly easy to do. Okay, so on the next step is that if you want to have a CLV with initial margins, and for some other books, if you refer to it, you probably notice that the CLV is actually have a little bit different formula, and it's because that it includes initial margin compared to the original model that we have seen up here. Okay, so it is actually the initial margin CLV formula would be M multiplied by 1 plus discount rate and divide that by 1 plus discount rate minus the retention rate. So if I were to run this, then if I see the value, so I called it CLV init, and now you probably notice that the CLV value is 550, whereas the original CLV value was 450. So you do notice that there was the 100 difference, which is happened to be the margin, the initial margin that we see here as 100. So that difference is just 450, and if you add the initial margin of 100, then that's why you get 550. Okay, so operating a simple CLV value isn't too complicated on SAS. You probably noticed that it's just providing the formula and using the data step, then it's fairly easy to do this. Okay, now let's make this a little bit more interesting here, because we don't want to have a infinite CLV. Maybe sometimes you want to set a finite setting in terms of how many years that you want to see. So in this case, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to look over a finite setting. So I'm not going to go over the initial case where you look at the infinite setting. So I'm just going to look up to 5 years and see what happened. Okay. So in that case, I would have to have the CLV per year. Okay. So the CLV per year has a formula of M multiplied by R raised to the power of I, and I is, by the way, the year iteration that we are going to have, and divide that by 1 plus the discount rate and raised to the power of I again, which is the year that we are going to go through. Okay, so this is the year of the CLV that we're going to have, and I'm going to add this by each year, and I'm going to put that value into sum. So once I do this sum, then what I'm gonna get is all the CLV values for each year, and that's gonna be added onto sum. And where do I get the 5-year setting? I have to have a do loop. So that's why I have a do loop here. And that's why it's going from I is equal to 1 year and all the way to 5 years. Okay. And let's see what happens if I run this. Okay, now this is what I get. Now I'm going to go into CLV fin because I named it as finite. And it seems that this is the CLV that I get for each year. Year 1, I get roughly around 81. Year 2, I get about 67. Year 3, I get about 55, and so on and so forth. And CLV sum, you probably notice that this is just adding the initial or the initial year, and then adding the second year, then I get 148. And if I add the third year to the original sum, then I get 204 and all the way to 285. Okay, now you can obviously change this to a different value. So for example, rather than having 5 years, I'm going to do it, for example, let's say 50 years. So that is very much close to the infinite case, but let's see what happens if I do it for 50 years. I'm just going to close this window first. Okay, if I run it for 50 years, let's see what happens to my CLV finite. And this is all the CLV sums that I'm going to get by year. And this is the sum that I would get. And at the last column here, you probably notice that the CLV for 50 years is 449.98, which is very much close to the infinite case of 450. So you remember that the infinite case, I got a CLV of 450. So if I have a setting of 50 years, then it's pretty much very close to infinite. So that's why you get a very much similar value. Okay. So that was the case for having a finite set with the original CLV model. But now maybe you're interested in doing this with a where you have a initial margin set up and you have it as 5 years. Okay, in that case, what you would do is that you still iterate the same way that you did for the original model, but however, rather than starting from 1, you start from 0. Okay, so if you start from 0, that is including the initial margin, and which is following this this formula. Okay, so if I were to run this, then let's see what happens. Now, so it has run everything run has successfully, and I call it CLV finite init, and this is the initial margin of 100, and you probably notice that it is just adding 100 to the initial year 1 of the case that we had for the CLV finite case. So it was originally 82, now I have 182. And all the way to the 5th year, if you remember, we had 285, and now we have 385. Okay, so this formula calculates the CLV for the finite case with initial margin, and in this case, I set it up to 5 years, and obviously you can probably change this parameter and change it to 20 years or 50 years or so on. Okay, so that was the part of running through basic CLV. And now let's look at a real business case here. So that was a pretty much, the previous example is pretty much a fabricated case that I made for myself, but let's look into a real business case and see what happens. Okay, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go to AT&T's site here. And if I open up, oh, it's already opened up. Yes, it's the same URL. Then what I would see is that I could go to quarterly earnings, and they provide an Excel sheet here with, okay, I'm just going to allow to open it, and with all the financial informations and the subscriber informations and so on. Okay, now it's starting to download. Okay, now there we go. Okay. So here let's go to business segment sheet. And what we probably notice that there is the operating revenues that we kind of probably use, and we have the operating expenses, and we have the segment contribution. Oh, so we can probably use this as the margin. Okay, and if I could go to business segment 2, what I probably notice is that I have the subscriber information. So I could see I have the total number of subscribers here. And I also notice that there is a churn rate. Okay, so this is a churn rate that I see for every quarter, starting from the 4th quarter of 2014 and all the way to 3rd quarter of 2016. And remember, this churn rate can be used as the retention rate because 1 minus churn rate is the retention rate. So I could probably use that information. And having that information in mind, I could copy all these value, and which I did already, by the way. So I copied out the revenue, operating expenses, segment contributions, and the total subscribers, and the postpaid churn. So I just happened to copy all this information into Excel already, and I just called it AT&T. Okay, I'm just going to close this. So now let's go back to SAS because I have that file already. So I just called it AT&T.Excel file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import this into SAS. Okay. And if I look at it, I called it AT&T1. So this is the information that I have imported. It's the same thing that you saw on the Excel file. And now you probably notice that this is in a more of a row settings, but however in SAS you have to change this as a column setting because that's how SAS really operates. So you have to change it in a column setting. And what I need to do is need to call a procedure called transpose. Okay, so if I transpose this, then what I'm going to get is, I called it AT&T2, and this is the value that I saw. I just renamed a few columns representing revenue, cost, and margin, and number of sub and churn. And this is the information that I get, and the original former variables and the label of variables, it was quite long if you remember, so SAS just gave it a default of a label and so on. Okay, so however, we're not going to really be needing that. We're going to be needing revenue, cost, margin, and number of subs. Okay, so that's why I named it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate the infinite CLV case. So I'm going to use the same formula that I had here. However, if you notice, the revenue and the cost were in $1,000,000. So in order to correctly account for the value, I'm going to multiply by $1,000,000 here. Okay, and however, the subscribers were by thousands. So in order to accurately account that, I also multiply 1,000 here. Okay, and the discount rate, I just assumed it as 1%. So 1% discount rate per quarter, I don't think it's too high. I know the yearly discount rate, normally the interest rate is proxied as a discount rate. The interest rate right now is roughly around 1% or a little less than 1%, but I think it's still a discount rate of 1 isn't too bad here. Okay. And as a quarter, I'm just going to use the number of observations in that column. Okay, so that I'm just going to name that as quarter. So it's going to just go from 1 to the number of rows that I had. In this case, it was 8 quarters, if you remember. And I'm going to calculate the CLV. And remember, this is just happened to be the same CLV formula that we used in this case. Okay. And now, in order to calculate the CLV per subscriber, because this is going to return a very large value, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to divide by number of subscribers so I could see how much CLV that AT&T is getting per subscriber. Okay, so now I'm going to run this. Okay, and let's see what I get here. I'm going to go to AT&T3, and yes, this is the value that I get. So it seems that the first quarter, if you remember, that was the 2014 fourth quarter, and this is a CLV value that AT&T is getting in the infinite case, and this is a lot of money. It seems that goes to, this is 1,000, a million, a billion, so $161 billion for all these subscribers that AT&T have. Obviously, this is too large to, kind of see whether this is a meaningful amount. But however, if you see it by subscriber, you probably notice that the CLV value per subscriber that AT&T is getting is roughly around 2,500. Okay, which kind of makes sense. It seems that AT&T is viewing one subscriber, and that subscriber has a customer lifetime value of $2,500. Okay, and I know it kind of varies by quarter, so maybe they did a little better job on 2015 first quarter because it went up to 3,200, and then it seems that that's the maximum. However, it seemed that there is some variance, but roughly around $3,000 is the CLV value that AT&T is getting per subscriber. Okay. Now this was the infinite case, and let's try to do this as the finite case. And yeah, it is probably a little bit more realistic to look at a finite case because telecom industry, yes, they kind of change in terms of technology. So maybe it's better to have a finite case and say, okay, I'm going to use this customer and calculate their CLV as a certain, maybe in 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, depending on the case that this is the technology they're subscribing. We're currently at 8 LTE. Maybe after 3 years, it's going to change to LTE-A, which is LTE Advanced. And in that case, they might have a higher CLV and so on. So let's say I'm going to limit as a finite and calculate just for 3 years. Okay. And in this case, 3 years happen to be 12 quarters because the quarters is the case that we had. Okay. And you probably noticed that besides the difference that you notice is there is now a do loop because I have to loop over for 12 quarters and I have to calculate each quarter's CLV here. And if you remember, this is the CLV for each quarter, and I'm going to add that up. And obviously, the CLV for the finite case, this is going to have a very large value. So I want to make it a little bit more realistic, and I want to calculate a CLV by subscriber. And so CLV finite case for subscriber, this will have a more realistic value than the very large value that I'm going to get for the CLV quarter sub. Okay. So I'm going to run this, and I called it as AT&T 4. So if I go into AT&T 4, now this is the value. Okay. So for the first quarter, it seems that AT&T is getting a CLV value for 3 years of roughly around $550. Okay, very realistic. So yes, this is how much it seems that AT&T is making off. And from a subscriber, assuming that they would be around for about 3 years, and it kind of varies between 500 goes to 550, and roughly it seems that 500, and I think the average is roughly around $600. So their margin or their CLV for value for having a subscriber for 3 years seems to be roughly around $600, which kind of may be making sense. Okay. So I kind of applied this to a real case, okay, and I hope this was a good example of reviewing CLV and calculating customer lifetime value on SAS. Okay, well, thank you for watching.